3 World Cups, over 1,000 goals, the most celebrated footballer who ever lived. When people think of Pelé, they think of that golden smile, the joy, the grace, the man who made the whole world fall in love with football. But what if I told you that behind that smile, Pelé carried a list, names he never forgot, people he never forgave. Not rivals who outplayed him, not managers who dropped him. We're talking about political betrayal, racial violence, personal humiliation, wounds that never fully closed, even as the trophies piled up and the world bowed at his feet. These are the 10 people Pelé could never forgive, and some of them were supposed to be on his side. Starting at number 10, and this one might surprise you, the Santos FC board. Santos was Pelé's home. He gave them 18 years, 4 South American titles, 2 Copa Libertadores, 2 Intercontinental Cups. He didn't just play for Santos, he built the club into a global name. Without Pelé, Santos FC is a mid-table Brazilian side nobody outside Sao Paulo has ever heard of. So when the club's administration began mismanaging funds, selling off youth talent for short-term cash, and slowly letting the infrastructure rot in the early 2000s, Pelé was openly disgusted. He spoke about it with a quiet, cutting bitterness that was far more damning than any angry outburst. He expected excellence. He got excuses. The relationship never fully recovered. Moving to number 9, Vicente Feola. Feola was the Brazil manager who picked Pelé for the 1958 World Cup at just 17 years old, and for that, Pelé was always grateful. But by 1966, that goodwill had been spent. Feola selected a bloated, aging squad and sent them into a tournament with no coherent plan and no protection for his most important player. When Brazil crashed out in the group stage, Feola blamed the players. Pelé called it a travelling circus in his autobiography, a group of talented individuals let down by a man who confused loyalty with tactics. He never questioned Feola's love of the game, he questioned his judgment, and in 1966, that distinction cost Brazil everything. Number 8 is Edmundo. Now, the Edmundo situation is one of the messier chapters in Brazilian football's long book of internal conflicts. Edmundo was enormously talented, powerful, direct, genuinely difficult to handle on his best days. But Pelé grew tired of the indiscipline, the controversy, the sense that Edmundo was squandering what God had given him. When Pelé made his criticisms public, Edmundo didn't take it quietly. He called Pelé a traitor, a man more interested in his own image than in supporting Brazilian players. Pelé's response was short and cold. "I have no time for that," he said, and he meant it. The two men never reconciled. For Pelé, it wasn't personal vanity, it was a belief that wearing the yellow shirt carried an obligation, and Edmundo had treated that obligation carelessly. The insults from rivals were one thing, but the betrayals from the men in suits, those cut far deeper. Number 7 takes us into genuinely dark territory, the 1974 Brazilian military junta. Brazil in the early 1970s was living under a military dictatorship. The generals understood Pelé's power perfectly. A smiling Pelé, holding a trophy, telling the people everything was fine. That image was worth more to the regime than any propaganda poster. They pressured him constantly to be their symbol of national joy while citizens were disappearing into detention centers. Pelé refused. Quietly, carefully, but firmly. He said it plainly. His football belonged to the people, not the generals. That refusal took more courage than any goal he ever scored, and the regime never forgave him for it. Number 6 is Ricardo Teixeira. As head of the CBF, Brazil's football confederation, Teixeira ran the national game like a personal empire. Pelé publicly accused him of doing more damage to Brazilian football than any opponent he'd ever faced on a pitch. In an open letter published in O Globo in 1994, Pelé laid it out plainly. A generation of talent was being exploited, money was disappearing, and the beautiful game was being turned into a business for a small group of powerful men. Teixeira dismissed it, but history backed Pelé up entirely. And then there's number 5, João Havelange. This is the deepest cut of the political betrayals. Havelange ran FIFA for 24 years, and Pelé believed he was corrupt from the very beginning. When Pelé began speaking openly about it, Havelange responded by having him excluded from the 1994 World Cup draw ceremony in the United States. Think about that. The greatest footballer in history barred from his own kingdom in retaliation for telling the truth. Pelé said it himself. Havelange tried to take his history away from him, not his medals, not his records, his history. When Havelange finally resigned from FIFA in 2013 amid corruption findings, the vindication came, but for Pelé, it arrived far too late for anything resembling forgiveness. Politics tried to silence him, but on the pitch, they tried something far worse. They didn't just want to beat him, they wanted to break him. Number 4 is Romario. And look, this one is complicated, because Romario was genuinely brilliant, one of the most natural finishers Brazil ever produced. In 1994, when Brazil finally lifted the World Cup again, Romario was the heartbeat of it. Pelé acknowledged that. He wasn't blind to talent, but the relationship between these two men was never warm, and it collapsed publicly in 2005 when Pelé, in the way he sometimes did, suggested Romario should consider retirement. He framed it as concern. Romario did not receive it that way. What came back was perhaps the most famous insult in the history of Brazilian football. Romario said Pelé was a poet when he kept his mouth shut. Not a bad footballer, not a flawed analyst, a poet, meaning stay quiet, your words are worthless, your opinions are decoration. That line landed like a fist. It was designed to, and Pelé, who had spent his entire career being gracious about rivals, found very little grace to offer in return. There was no reconciliation, no handshake moment, just a silence that said everything. Moving to number 3, and this one is more layered than most people realize. Lionel Messi. This wasn't pure malice on Pelé's part. That's the nuance that always gets lost. When Pelé made his famous one leg, one trick comment about Messi, it wasn't a football argument. It was something more personal than that. Pelé had watched for years as the global media began building a new mountain and crowning Messi at the top of it. Every time Messi broke a record, every time a journalist asked who was the greatest of all time and answered their own question before the words were out of their mouth, Pelé felt something. Not jealousy exactly, something more like erasure. Because Pelé hadn't just played football, he had survived football. He had endured things on and off the pitch that no amount of talent should require a man to endure. And to watch the conversation move past him, as though his 3 World Cups and everything he carried to win them was simply a footnote, that stung in a way that came out sideways, in comments that sounded petty, but were rooted in something much deeper. He never truly made peace with it, and Messi, for his part, was never given the chance to offer any. Number 2 is Diego Maradona. And here's the tragedy of this one. On the surface, these two men had a friendship, appearances together, mutual respect paid in public, the sense that the two greatest footballers of their era understood something about each other that nobody else could. Underneath that, a decade of war. Maradona's most cutting charge was that Pelé had become a museum piece in FIFA's pocket, a smiling figurehead used to legitimize an organization that Maradona, with some justification, believed was rotten. And that accusation stung, partly because Pelé had spent years fighting that exact system, and partly because there was a grain of political truth in it that he couldn't entirely dismiss. Pelé's counter was about character, about respecting the jersey, about what it meant to represent your country and your sport with dignity. Neither man was entirely wrong, neither man was entirely right, and now both of them are gone, and the feud outlived any chance of real peace. That's the tragedy sitting underneath all the noise. Two of the greatest who ever lived, and they never found the conversation that might have mattered most. Rivals, politicians, administrators, they all left their mark, but nothing cut as deep as what happened to Pelé in England in the summer of 1966. Number 1 isn't a single person, it's a system, and it wore the faces of the Bulgarian and Portuguese defenders who hunted Pelé across the 1966 World Cup pitches while referees watched and did nothing. Pelé arrived in England as the greatest footballer on the planet. He was 25 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, and he barely got to play. What he got instead was a sustained, deliberate campaign of physical destruction. Ankle-high tackles, studs aimed at his knee, defenders who had clearly decided before the whistle that their job was not to play against Pelé, but to remove him from the tournament entirely. The referees let it happen, repeatedly, systematically. And when Pelé eventually limped out of that World Cup, broken and furious, he said it plainly. They didn't want to play football. They wanted to destroy him. He felt, in his own words, like he was being hunted like an animal. But here's what the football world has never been fully honest about. This wasn't just brutality, it was a message. Because Pelé was a black man who had become the undisputed greatest in the world. and European football in 1966 was not ready to accept that without resistance. The physical style used against him, the kind that referees somehow never felt the need to punish, was not applied equally. It was concentrated, it was targeted, and it came wrapped in monkey chants from the terraces that nobody in authority saw fit to address. The Brazilian junta had tried to weaponize his blackness as propaganda. Havelange's world had marginalized him politically, and the 1966 tournament was the most visible and violent expression of a football establishment that had never truly accepted a black man as king, regardless of what the trophies said. Pelé spoke about 1966 until his final years. He never softened it, never reframed it into something easier to hear. He said he saw things in England that made him want to leave the game forever. He didn't leave, but he never forgot. And for that particular wound, the one opened by an entire system rather than a single man, forgiveness was never going to come. Pelé left the world in December 2022, carrying every one of these names, not out of bitterness, but because silence protects the wrong people. He spoke so the next black king on the pitch wouldn't have to fight those same battles alone. That was always the point, not grievance, legacy. If his story moved you, send your prayers for the king in the comments below. And if you want more on the legends who shaped the beautiful game, the glory, the pain, everything in between, hit the like button and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.
Well, I'm hard on people that need to be hard. For people who don't need to be hard, I'm the very opposite. So there's a balance, as you say. I mean, I think that if a man needs, who's playing in front of the public, is being well paid, and he doesn't dedicate himself to the job, I would be hard on him. If I could, I'd put him in jail, out the road, society, because he's a menace.
Bill Shankly didn't just manage Liverpool Football Club, he built it. From a second division club with leaking roofs and broken dreams into the most feared team in England. He was a god on the Mersey, the kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone in it feel like they were either his soldier or his enemy. But gods don't forgive easily, and Shankly, he never forgot a thing. Today, we're going through 7 names, 7 men, 7 moments that Shankly simply could not let go of. Some were rivals, some were legends he publicly tore apart while privately worshipping. And one, the most painful of all, came from inside his own house. So let's get into it. Number 1. Bobby Moore. Bobby Moore was the kind of player that made other managers nervous just by showing up. England's World Cup captain. Elegant, commanding, the finest defender this country has ever produced. And Shankly, he hated facing him. Not because he disliked the man, but because Moore was simply that good. Before one match against West Ham, Shankly pulled Kevin Keegan aside and went to work. He told him Moore had bags under his eyes, that he was limping, that he even had dandruff. Every word carefully placed, designed to plant a seed of doubt, to make Keegan believe that this giant of the game was somehow beatable on that particular day. It was classic Shankly. Not shouting, not ranting, just quiet, deliberate, surgical. He understood that the battle started in the mind long before anyone touched a ball. And if he could get Keegan to walk onto that pitch believing Moore was even 5% less than perfect, that was 5% Shankly had manufactured out of nothing. Then the whistle blew, and Moore was Moore. After the game, Shankly quietly found Keegan again. The mask came down. He looked at him and said, "You'll never play against anyone better than him." No fanfare, no long speech, just a private confession that said everything. That was Shankly's war with his own respect. He couldn't forgive Moore for being that brilliant on the wrong side. So he buried the admiration under mind games and kept it moving. Moore never wore red, never played at Anfield, never gave Shankly what he secretly wanted, which was that kind of player in his own squad. And in a strange way, that gap was never filled. Shankly could build teams, he could build legends, but Bobby Moore was something the game only produced once. Number 2. The Manchester United Holy Trinity. George Best, Denis Law, Bobby Charlton. Shankly once walked into Old Trafford and, with a completely straight face, dismissed all 3 of them in one breath. One was too old, one had a dicky knee, and the other, he said, was a drunk. Three of the greatest footballers Britain has ever seen, reduced to that in about 10 seconds flat. Now, let's be honest about what was happening there. This wasn't ignorance, this was warfare. And the delivery was everything. He didn't pause, didn't stumble, battled it off like he was reading a shopping list. Three of the most celebrated players in British football history gone in 10 seconds flat. That was the craft of it, the calmness, the straight face. If Shankly had laughed or smirked, it would have been a joke, but he didn't. So it landed like fact. Bobby Charlton, World Cup winner, European Cup winner, the heartbeat of that United side. Too old, apparently. George Best, arguably the most gifted footballer these islands ever produced, the drunk in Shankly's version. And Denis Law, the Dickie knee. Last one cuts deepest, because Shankly knew Denis Law better than almost anyone. He gave Law his debut as a teenager at Huddersfield. He was there at the very beginning. He watched that talent grow from nothing, and then he stood at Old Trafford and reduced him to a knee problem. You don't do that to a man you've forgotten. You do that to a man you remember too well. Shankly had been the one who spotted Law as a teenager in Huddersfield, a raw, angular kid who looked like he'd been built for football but hadn't been told yet how to use it. Shankly saw it before almost anyone else did, handed him his debut, and then Denis Law went on to become one of the greatest forwards the game has ever seen. And he did it wearing the red of Manchester United, not the red of Liverpool. That detail mattered. To Shankly, it probably always did. The truth is, Shankly held all three of them in enormous regard. But United were the enemy, and when the enemy walks onto the pitch, you don't hand them confidence, you strip it away. Every dismissal was a tactic. Every cutting word was a weapon. Make sure to like and subscribe. And now, back to the video. Couldn't forgive them for wearing red. Just the wrong shade of it. Number 3. Don Revie. Manchester United rivalry was about psychology and ego. The rivalry with Leeds United was something different entirely. That one had teeth, real teeth, the kind that left marks long after the final whistle. Leeds under Don Revie were a genuine force, dominant, organised, relentless. They won titles, they reached European finals, and on paper you could admire what Revie built there. Shankly couldn't, because the way Leeds played, the way they went about their business on that pitch, was everything Shankly stood against. He had a word for it. Leeds United, they're a team of hackers. Now, that line might sound like throwaway banter, but nothing from Shankly was throwaway. He was a working-class man who believed football belonged to working-class people, and that it should be played with pride, with skill, with something that looked like beauty when it was done right. Not just won at any price, but won the right way. That distinction mattered to him as much as the result itself. Revie's Leeds were the opposite of that. Win first, worry about the rest later. Grind teams down, rough them up, and take the points home. And in Shankly's eyes, that wasn't just a different tactical approach, it was a betrayal of what the game was actually supposed to be. What made it sharper still was this. These were two men from similar worlds, both working class, both had built their clubs from almost nothing, both understood exactly what it cost to do what they had done. In another life, they might have understood each other completely. Revie had turned Leeds into something real. Titles, European finals, a squad with genuine steel in it. Shankly could see the quality underneath the grime. He wasn't blind, but standing on opposite sides of that rivalry, all Shankly could see was a manager who had taken the wrong road and was winning on it. Results earned through methods he couldn't respect. And that, maybe more than anything else, was what he could not let go of, because it raised an uncomfortable question. What if ugly football worked just as well as beautiful football? Shankly had built his entire identity on the answer being no. Revie kept making the answer complicated. Number 4, Brian Clough. Now this one is complicated, genuinely complicated, because in so many ways, Brian Clough was the closest thing to Shankly that English football ever produced. Working class, outspoken, fiercely sharp, a man who could walk into a broken club and turn it into something that shouldn't have been possible. Clough did it at Derby, he did it at Nottingham Forest, he won European Cups with a club that had absolutely no business winning them. Shankly saw all of that. and it unsettled him. Not because he didn't respect it, but because Clough was so loud about it. The big interviews, the sharp quotes, constant sense that Clough always needed the last word, the performance of it all. And here's the irony that everyone could see, except maybe the two of them. Shankly was exactly the same. Every bit as outspoken, every bit as sharp, every bit as certain that his way was the right way. Two mirrors facing each other, and neither one prepared to look. Shankly found Clough too much noise, too much ego, too much of the very thing Shankly himself was doing every single day. But here's the detail that changes everything. After Shankly retired, Clough became one of the very few managers he would actually go and visit. Quietly, no cameras, no performance, just two men who understood what the other had built, sitting together without the noise, away from the press, away from the performance. Two men who had both dragged clubs to places nobody thought possible, and who probably only felt truly understood by each other. Clough won 2 European Cups with Nottingham Forest, a club that had no business being on that stage. Shankly understood exactly how much that cost. The sleepless nights, the staff you had to trust completely, the players you had to push past what they thought their limit was. He knew the blueprint because he'd lived it, and that shared knowledge was bigger than any public rivalry. He couldn't stand him, and he couldn't stay away from him either. That contradiction doesn't make the friction less real, it just makes it more honest. Number 5. Tommy Smith. If Shankly had a player who was built in his own image, not in elegance, not in touch, but in sheer bloody-minded will, it was Tommy Smith, the Anfield Iron, a man who played football the way some people start arguments, with full commitment and absolutely zero apology. Shankly loved him for it. And the only way Shankly knew how to love a player, which was to push him harder, challenge him constantly, and make it perfectly clear that the club always came first. Always. No exceptions, no negotiations. He once looked Smith dead in the eye and told him, "You son, you could start a riot in a graveyard." Coming from anyone else, that might be a warning. Coming from Shankly was practically a knighthood. That was his version of high praise, wrapped in a threat, delivered without blinking. But here's where it gets cold. When Smith picked up a serious knee injury, Shankly didn't call it Tommy's knee. He called it Liverpool's knee. Not the player's pain, not the man's body, the club's property. The club's problem to fix and move on from. There was no cruelty intended. Not really. That was simply Shankly's gospel. The player belonged to Liverpool. The sacrifice belonged to Liverpool. Everything you had, every last drop of it, was owed to the badge. Tommy Smith understood that. He lived by it. But understanding something and finding it easy to swallow are two very different things. Their relationship was built entirely on friction and mutual respect. The kind that never got soft, never got sentimental, and never needed to. Smith didn't need Shankly to put an arm around him. He needed Shankly to demand more. And Shankly delivered that every single day without fail. There was a strange purity to it. No confusion about what was expected. No ambiguity about where the line was. You played for Liverpool. You gave everything. You didn't ask for thanks. Shankly made Tommy Smith what he was, and Tommy Smith, in return, proved that Shankly's methods actually worked. The tension between them was never really about dislike. It was about standards. Impossibly high, completely non-negotiable standards. Number 6. Everton. Now, if everyone else on this list carried real personal history, genuine friction, genuine feeling, Everton is different. Because Shankly's feelings about Everton weren't built on a grudge exactly. They were built on something almost worse than that. Pure dismissal. He once said, "When I've nothing better to do, I look down the league table to see how Everton are getting on." Read that again. Not anger, not obsession, the faint, almost bored acknowledgement that they existed somewhere below him. That was the insult. And then there was the line every Liverpool fan has memorized for life. There are only 2 teams in Liverpool, Liverpool and Liverpool Reserves. In a city split down the middle by 2 clubs, that wasn't just a quote. That was a statement of identity, a line drawn in the concrete of the Mersey. Everton didn't occupy the same mental space as Leeds or United for Shankly. They were closer to home, which made the dismissal cut even deeper. You don't hand your neighbours that kind of line unless you're completely certain they can't fire back. And Shankly was certain. He'd made sure of it. He'd built a club that had made the city lean one way. And he knew it. The Everton line wasn't cruelty, it was confidence. Absolute, unshakable confidence in what he had built on his side of the city. For Shankly, Everton weren't really a rival, they were background noise. And somehow, that was the most devastating thing he could have said. Number 7. The Liverpool Board of Directors. And here's where it stops being about tactics. Here's where it stops being about rivals and mind games and psychological warfare. This one was personal. This one was about belonging. Shankly had a line he used to describe football clubs. At a football club, there's a holy trinity: the players, the manager, and the supporters. Directors don't come into it. Simple, direct. And if you know anything about the man, you know he meant every single word. The board lived in a different world to Shankly. A world of suits and balance sheets, decisions made in rooms that smelled nothing like a training pitch. He tolerated them because he had to. He worked around them when he could. But he never trusted them, not fully, because in his mind, those men had never stood in the cold at 5 in the morning, never broken down footage until their eyes gave out, never had to look a player in the face and tell him his career was finished. They hadn't earned the right to the club the way he had. And then came 1974. Shankly had just won the FA Cup. Liverpool were at the peak of their powers. He was 60 years old, tired in ways the cameras couldn't pick up, and he made the decision that would quietly haunt the rest of his life. He resigned. Nobody really saw it coming, and by most accounts, neither did Shankly, not in the way it actually played out, because what followed wasn't a dignified farewell. There was no role waiting for him, no ambassador's seat, no desk at Anfield, no official position, nothing that acknowledged what he had given to that club across 15 years of his life. He started showing up at Melwood, training ground he had helped build, a place where he had spent the best years of his working life. He'd laid the foundations of that place, shaped the culture of it, watched it become something the rest of English football looked at with envy. And now he was showing up like a man stopping by someone else's garden. And bit by bit, quietly, without any dramatic confrontation, the message became clear. That world no longer belonged to him. The players he had shaped now belonged to Bob Paisley's era. Routines he had built now ran perfectly well without him. He was a visitor in his own house. The board hadn't thrown him out. They had done something quieter and in some ways much worse. They had simply moved on. And a man like Shankly, a man whose entire identity was sewn into that club, had no idea what to do with himself when the club no longer needed him back. He gave Liverpool everything: his health, his time, 15 years of his family's weekends. And when it was over, they handed him a clock and showed him the door. That was the one he never got over. Not Moore, not Clough, not Revie, the men inside his own house. 7 names, 7 moments, and every single one tells you more about Shankly than the men on the list. He set the bar impossibly high, for others and for himself. The rivals he couldn't respect, players he drove until they broke or became legends, the peers he publicly dismissed and privately admired, and the institution he built from the ground up that quietly moved on without him the moment he stepped back. That was the full picture of the man, not just the quotes, not just the trophies, the contradictions, the grudges, the private confessions, and the wounds he never quite let heal. That was Bill Shankly. If this story moved you, send some prayers for him in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss another one.
Como esporte, ele tem uma relação muito próxima da dança. Nem sempre bem treinadas, mas teoricamente tem um conteúdo de expressão corporal muito mais interessante do que o jogo em si.
Most players just played the game. Socrates judged it. He was a doctor, a philosopher, a man who believed football was more than a sport. It was a mirror of society. And when he looked into that mirror, he didn't always like what he saw. So today, we're going inside the mind of one of Brazil's greatest ever players, a man with a list, 10 footballers who in his eyes betrayed everything the beautiful game was supposed to stand for. Some of them were rivals, some were teammates, and some, they were the biggest stars on the planet. Let's talk about who Socrates actually was, because without that, none of this makes sense. Braz Oliveira Socrates was born in 1954 in Belém, Brazil. By the time he was playing for Corinthians in the late 70s, he was already different from everyone else. Tall, bearded, always with a cigarette in his hand, sometimes even at training. He moved slowly on the pitch, deliberately, almost lazily, but his vision was something else entirely. He saw the game 3 or 4 moves ahead of everyone around him, but football was only part of the story. While he was still playing professionally, he earned a full medical degree. He read political philosophy in his spare time, and in 1982, he helped build something at Corinthians that had never been done before in professional football, the Democracia Corinthiana, a democratic movement inside the club where players, staff, and even the kit man had an equal vote on club decisions, transfers, training schedules, everything. One person, one vote. That tells you everything about how Socrates saw the world. Football was supposed to be collective, artistic, free, a socialist act of beauty where no single man was bigger than the whole. So when he looked around at the game and saw players who embodied the opposite of that, players who destroyed, who dominated through fear, who sold themselves to corporations, or who built cults around their own name, it didn't sit well with him, not even a little bit. So when Socrates looked around at the game he loved, here's what and who he saw. Number 10. Marco Tardelli. If you've ever watched the 1982 World Cup, you know exactly what Tardelli looked like on a football pitch. Relentless, aggressive, always pressing, always closing, always hunting. He was the kind of player who made the other team feel like they couldn't breathe, and that was precisely the problem for Socrates. Brazil in 1982 was built on breathing, on patience, on trusting that if you kept the ball and kept moving, the goal would come. Socrates, Zico, Falcao, Eder, that squad is still talked about as one of the greatest teams to never win a World Cup. They didn't press, they didn't chase, they played. Tardelli was everything they were not. His energy was reactive, chaotic, physical. To Socrates, that kind of football wasn't just a different style, it was a philosophical statement. It said, destroy what they're trying to build. And that was unforgivable. Number 9. Dino Zoff. Zoff was Italy's captain in 1982. He was also 40 years old at that World Cup, making him one of the oldest players ever to lift the trophy. Legendary status, no question about that. But Socrates never cared much for the trophy. He cared about how you earned it. Italy in 1982 didn't attack. They sat deep, absorbed pressure, and waited for their moment. They drew their first 3 group games. They scraped through, and yet they ended up world champions. To Socrates, that result sent a terrible message to the game. That patience and beauty were worth less than organization and resilience, that a team willing to sacrifice creativity could outlast one built entirely on it. Zoff, as captain, was the face of that, and Socrates never quite let it go. Number 8. Claudio Gentile. This one was personal. Gentile was Italy's man marker in 1982, and his assignment against Zico, Socrates' closest footballing ally, arguably the most technically gifted player Brazil had, was one of the most brutal displays of defensive football that tournament had ever seen. Gentile didn't just mark Zico, he grabbed him, held him, fouled him repeatedly, knowing the referee wouldn't send him off. He made it physically impossible for Zico to play, and it worked. Zico was neutralized. Brazil lost. There are actual statistics from that match that show Gentile committed over 20 fouls during that World Cup campaign, and went unpunished in ways that would be impossible today. For Socrates, watching it happen in real time was like watching someone take a painting and slash it with a knife. Gentile wasn't competing, he was destroying, and the game allowed it. That, in Socrates' view, was the moment the sport showed its true colors. Not the score, not the trophy. The fact that a man could reduce one of the most gifted players alive to a passenger through physical intimidation rather than footballing intelligence, and be celebrated for it. Gentile represented the triumph of destruction over creation, and to a man who spent his entire life fighting for the opposite, that was the deepest kind of betrayal. These 3, Tardelli, Zoff, Gentile, weren't just footballers Socrates disliked. They were symbols. Symbols of a game that was slowly choosing the practical over the poetic. But it wasn't just the Italians who got under his skin. Number 7. Lothar Matthäus. If Gentile was a knife, Matthäus was a machine. Precise, relentless, built to win at all costs through any system, in any role the game demanded of him. And on paper, that sounds like a compliment, because Matthäus was genuinely one of the best midfielders the world has ever seen. He won the World Cup. He won the Ballon d'Or. He played at 5 World Cups across almost 2 decades. By any measure, his career was extraordinary. But Socrates didn't measure players that way. What Matthäus represented to Socrates was the German system in its purest form. Discipline above everything. Structure above everything. The individual talent completely absorbed into the machine. You watched Matthäus play and you never once felt like he was enjoying it. You felt like he was executing it. There's a difference, a big one. Socrates believed football should feel like something. It should carry an emotion, a spirit, a sense that the players on the pitch actually loved being there. Matthäus was brilliant, but he played like a soldier following orders. Every run calculated, every decision optimized. And to Socrates, that wasn't football. That was engineering. The German style of football, rigid shape, high press, intense physical conditioning, was the direct opposite of everything the Democratia Corinthiana stood for. No freedom, no poetry, just output. And Matthäus was its greatest product. Number 6. Oliver Kahn. Now we move from midfield to goal. And Kahn was a different kind of problem entirely. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Kahn had become the most dominant goalkeeper in the world. He was enormous, physically terrifying. He screamed at his defenders. He punched the air, punched the ball, and sometimes looked like he wanted to punch the opposition. He won the 2001 Champions League final almost single-handedly, saving 3 penalties in the shootout against Valencia. And Socrates hated what he stood for. Not Kahn personally. This wasn't personal. It never was with Socrates. The idea of Kahn, the muscular, intimidating, war-ready goalkeeper, dominated through fear and physical presence. Socrates grew up watching a different kind of goalkeeping. Elegant, instinctive, goalkeepers who read the game, who positioned themselves brilliantly, who made difficult saves look almost casual. Kahn made everything look like a battle. And to Socrates, that was football moving in exactly the wrong direction. The game was becoming more aggressive, more physical, more machine-like at every position, even in goal. It was one more sign that the sport he loved was slowly turning into something he didn't recognize. Number 5. Paolo Rossi. And here we are, back to 1982, back to Spain. Back to the match that haunted Socrates for the rest of his life. Paolo Rossi had been suspended for 2 years before that World Cup, his alleged involvement in a match-fixing scandal in Italy. He came back, he was rusty for the first few games of the tournament, and nobody really considered him a serious threat. Brazil certainly didn't. Then came the 5th of July 1982. Italy versus Brazil in the second group stage. Brazil only needed a draw to go through. They had Socrates, they had Zico, they had Falcao, they had the best attacking football in the tournament. Rossi scored 3 times, a hat-trick. Brazil lost 3-2 and went home. What made it so unbearable for Socrates wasn't just the result, it was how Rossi did it. He didn't dominate the game, he barely touched the ball outside of his moments. He didn't create, he didn't build. He lurked and he punished. 3 moments of clinical precision, and Brazil's dream and Socrates' greatest footballing team was finished forever. To a man who believed every player had a responsibility to contribute to the beauty of the game, Rossi was the ultimate contradiction. He won without giving anything back. He scored without playing, and somehow the world rewarded him for it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and now back to the video. Then there were the stars, the ones the whole world loved. Socrates wasn't so sure. Number 4. Ruud Gullit. Here's where it gets complicated, because the next 3 names on this list weren't destroyers, they weren't machines, they were genuinely, undeniably brilliant, and that almost made it worse for Socrates. Ruud Gullit was one of the most complete footballers the world has ever seen. He could play as a forward, a midfielder, second striker. He was fast, strong, technically exceptional, and he had a football intelligence that put him in a different category from most of his generation. He won the 1988 European Championship with the Netherlands and was named the best player in the world that same year. So what was Socrates' problem with him? It wasn't the talent. Socrates never argued with talent. His problem was with what Gullit represented in a broader sense, the growing obsession with the athlete over the artist. By the late 80s, the game was shifting. Physical conditioning was becoming everything. Clubs were investing in bigger, faster, stronger players. And Gullit, with his extraordinary physique, was being celebrated as the future of football. Socrates looked at that and felt something slipping away. The game was rewarding bodies instead of minds. It was valuing power over patience. And when the whole world held Gullit up as the model of what a modern footballer should look like, Socrates saw it as a quiet but definitive statement that the game no longer valued what he had built his entire career on: vision, intelligence, collective beauty. Gullit had all of those things too, but the conversation around him never started there. Number 3. Diego Maradona. This is the entry that will surprise people most, because if there was ever a footballer who played with the kind of creative freedom Socrates preached, it was Maradona. He was extraordinary. Socrates knew that. He said it himself on multiple occasions. Maradona was a genius, full stop. But genius was never the issue. What Socrates couldn't accept was the cult that grew around Maradona, the way the entire footballing world began to organize itself around the idea that one man could carry a team, save a nation, win a tournament through sheer individual will. Argentina in 1986 wasn't a great team. They were a vehicle built entirely for one passenger. And to Socrates, that was the opposite of everything football should be. He had spent years inside the Democracia Corinthiana, proving that a group of equal voices, working together, could achieve more than any hierarchy built around a single authority. Football, in his mind, was the same. The moment you handed the keys to one man and told the rest to follow, you had already lost something essential. You'd turned a team into a religion, and Maradona, whether he intended it or not, became its god. Socrates never blamed Maradona for his genius. He blamed the world for what it did with it. Number 2. Michel Platini. And then there's Platini, the most elegant entry on this list. The one Socrates probably wrestled with the most, because on the surface, it should have been kindred spirits. Platini was a thinking footballer, a leader, a man who talked about the game with intelligence and passion. He was the best player in Europe across 3 consecutive years in the mid-80s, winning the Ballon d'Or each time. He was technical, creative, and deeply influential. But Socrates watched something happen to Platini and to European football around him that troubled him deeply. The game was shifting from collective art to personal brand. Platini became the face of that era's football, not just as a player, but as an institution. His name, his image, his statistics became the story. The team faded into the background. Socrates had spent his entire life arguing that no single player's name should matter more than the shirt. And here was European football's greatest icon proving the opposite. That if you were brilliant enough, your name was the only thing that mattered. He didn't begrudge Platini his greatness. He grieved what the game became in its shadow. And then there's number 1, the one that hit closest to home. Number 1. Ronaldo Nazario. This one hurt differently, because Ronaldo wasn't an Italian defender sent to destroy Brazilian football. He wasn't a German midfielder running on pure discipline. He was Brazilian, one of their own. A boy from Bento Ribeiro in Rio de Janeiro, who grew up playing on the same streets, breathing the same air, loving the same game that Socrates had given his life to. And by the late 90s, Ronaldo had become something Socrates could barely recognize. The talent was never in question. At his peak, Ronaldo was the most frightening footballer on the planet. The speed, the control, the finishing. There has never been anyone quite like him in that phase of his career. Socrates acknowledged that freely. What happened around Ronaldo, what was built around him, was the thing that troubled Socrates most. By 1998, Ronaldo wasn't just a footballer, he was a brand. He had one of the most lucrative sponsorship deals in the history of sport, a contract with Nike so enormous that it reportedly influenced which matches he played in. When he appeared in the 1998 World Cup final in France looking visibly unwell, having reportedly suffered a seizure hours before kickoff, there were serious questions raised about whether commercial pressure had played a role in the decision to field him. Brazil lost 3-0 to France. Ronaldo barely looks like himself. Socrates looked at all of that and saw the end game of everything he had spent his career fighting against. A Brazilian player, the face of Brazilian football, reduced to a product. His health, his performance, his entire identity handed over to corporations who cared about the logo on his shirt more than the man inside it. He had built the Democracia Corinthiana to prove that players were people first, citizens first, that football should serve the human being, not consume him. Ronaldo's story, to Socrates, was proof that the machine had finally won, that the game he had loved, fought for, and refused to compromise on had been completely swallowed by commerce. And the cruelest part was that it wore a Brazilian face. That was number 1. Not because Ronaldo was the worst footballer on this list, but because his story was the most complete summary of everything Socrates feared the game was becoming. Socrates left the world on December 4th, 2011, still talking, still unfiltered, still himself until the very end. He never softened his views, as softening them would have meant accepting what the game had become, and that was something he was never willing to do. Send some prayers for the doctor in the comments below, and if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this.
Between Hunter and Lee. March. But quite how much of that the referee saw, I'm not sure. And it looks to me as if it's broken out again. It's broken out again, and now this time...
Norman Hunter didn't just play football, he policed it. He was the man every forward dreaded seeing in their peripheral vision, the one who'd arrive not with a warning, but with a consequence. Bites your legs wasn't a joke. It was a reputation built across 15 years at Leeds United, forged in the most feared backline English football has ever seen. But here's the thing about men who never back down on the pitch. They don't always let things go off it either. Hunter carried grudges the way other men carry trophies. 7 names in particular. 7 players he never truly forgave. This is that list. There's a specific kind of player that gets under a certain kind of defender's skin. Not the ones who are dangerous. Hunter could respect dangerous. It's the ones who make the whole thing look like a performance. Rodney Marsh was that player. Marsh was everything Hunter wasn't. Flamboyant, loose, unpredictable in a way that felt almost theatrical. He'd flick the ball over your head and grin. He'd nutmeg you and pause, just long enough for the crowd to react. For Hunter, that wasn't football. That was showboating. And showboating, in his world, was disrespect. Not just to the opposition, but to the game itself. Their encounters on the pitch weren't your typical bruising duels. Hunter couldn't bully Marsh into submission the way he could with most forwards. Marsh had this almost maddening nonchalance under pressure. He never seemed rattled, never seemed to care that the most fearsome defender in England was closing him down. That kind of indifference drove Hunter to the edge. And it wasn't just one club. Marsh carried that attitude through QPR and into Manchester City like he was on a personal tour of every ground in England, specifically designed to get under Hunter's skin. Everywhere Marsh went, the showmanship followed. The flicks, the back heels, the unnecessary spins. Hunter watched it all and saw the same thing every time. A man treating the game like entertainment rather than a profession. What bothered Hunter most wasn't that Marsh was good, it was that Marsh seemed to enjoy the chaos. He'd invite contact, play through it, then shrug it off like it was nothing. For a man like Hunter, who treated every match as a matter of professional pride, that attitude was almost offensive. The grudge here wasn't rooted in one tackle or one confrontation. It ran deeper than that, a fundamental clash of values. Hunter believed in hard work, discipline, collective. Marsh believed in himself. Every time they shared a pitch, those two philosophies collided, and Hunter, for his part, never made peace with what Marsh represented. Hunter was asked once, years later, whether he'd enjoyed playing against Marsh. He paused longer than he needed to before answering. That pause said more than his words did. Speaking of values colliding, what happens when the clash isn't philosophical, but physical, when the grudge has blood and history behind it? Leeds and Liverpool in the early 1970s wasn't just a football rivalry, it was a war conducted in 90-minute installments. Two clubs convinced they were the best in England, beating each other repeatedly in moments of maximum pressure. When those sides crossed paths, the matches were tight, brutal, and often crossed every line that existed. Steve Highway was Liverpool's weapon, quick, intelligent, always moving in ways that were hard to prepare for. His ability to drift wide and cut inside meant that marking him cleanly was almost impossible, and Hunter's job was always to make the impossible possible. Their battles throughout the decade were notoriously physical. Not dirty in the pantomime sense, but hard in the way that leaves marks that don't show up on any medical report. Hunter couldn't neutralize Highway the way he could others. Highway had pace and awareness, the two things that make a defender's life genuinely difficult. He was also smart enough to know exactly where Hunter was at all times, which meant he could use that awareness against him, drawing the foul, winning the free kick, and doing it in positions that genuinely hurt Leeds. The rivalry built over years of encounters, and what started as professional hostility slowly became something more personal. Each match added another layer. By the time the mid-70s arrived, there was no warmth between them, just respect on one side and unresolved friction on the other. Hunter later admitted that Liverpool, more than any other club, knew how to get inside Leeds' head, and Highway was a large part of that. He was never the loudest name in those Liverpool sides, but for a defender like Hunter, he was quietly one of the hardest problems to solve. Some wounds are made by big, dramatic moments. Others are made by the same small cut, week after week, season after season. But if Highway was the thorn in Hunter's side, Denis Law was the knife. The Roses derbies, Leeds against Manchester United, were tribal in a way that goes beyond what most football matches become. These were communities settling old scores through sport, and the players understood that completely. They didn't play those matches, they fought them. Denis Law was United's most dangerous forward, but it was never just about what he did on the ball that got to Hunter. It was what he said off it. During one of their infamous clashes, Law reportedly threatened to break Hunter's legs. Not in the heat of a split second, deliberately, directly, looking him in the eye. Hunter never forgot it. Not because it frightened him, nothing frightened Norman Hunter, but because it crossed into territory that even he considered personal. There was a code among the hard men of that era. You could hurt someone in the act of football. You could tackle through the ball. You could leave your foot in. But you didn't make it a threat. You didn't make it a promise. Law made it both. What followed across their subsequent meetings was less football and more score settling. Hunter went into every Roses derby with Law's words somewhere in the back of his mind, and Law knew exactly what he'd started. The tribal nature of that rivalry made it something neither man could step back from. You have to understand what the Roses derbies meant to these men. It wasn't Chelsea versus Leeds, the hatred was about style and class. This was Yorkshire versus Lancashire. Generations of rivalry folded into 90 minutes. The players didn't arrive at those matches looking for a clean contest. They arrived looking to win something that went far deeper than 3 points. And when Law opened his mouth and made it personal with Hunter, he poured fuel onto a fire that was already burning at maximum heat. Hunter never forgave the words. But more than that, he never forgave what they turned him into on those days. The version of himself he became in those matches wasn't the professional he prided himself on being. It was something rawer than that and harder to put back in the box. 2 Chelsea names come next, and if you think Highway and Law pushed things to the edge, wait until you see what happened at Wembley in the years that followed it. The 1970 FA Cup final replay between Leeds United and Chelsea is one of the most talked about matches in English football history. Not because of the football, because of what it became. Old Trafford, April 29th, 1970. Extra time. A night match under floodlights, the pitch cutting up badly, the temperature between the two sets of players already at boiling point before a ball was kicked. What unfolded over those 90-plus minutes wasn't just rough, it was something closer to organised violence with a referee present, and Ian Hutchinson was right at the centre of it. Hutchinson was Chelsea's physical presence, powerful, combative, and completely unbothered by the kind of confrontation that sends most players retreating. He and Hunter found each other early in that match, and what followed was less a football contest between two men and more a sustained brawl dressed up as one. Their exchanges were unchecked in a way that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of modern scrutiny. The referee that night seemed to be watching a different match. Hunter never spoke about Hutchinson without something shifting in his expression. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter than that, and somehow heavier. Whatever happened between them in that replay left a mark that years of distance never quite faded. It wasn't just the physical brutality, though there was plenty of that. It was the sense that both men had gone somewhere that night they couldn't fully come back from. The 1970 FA Cup final replay was Chelsea's night in the end. They won 2-1. For Hunter, that loss compounded everything. The violence, the exhaustion, the sense that something wrong had happened on that pitch and nobody had stopped it. And then the result, on top of all of it. He carried both things, the unresolved anger at Hutchinson and the title that got away. Hutchinson left the world in 2002, aged just 54. The bitterness Hunter carried never had anywhere to go after that. Some grudges outlive the people they're aimed at. Peter Osgood was a different kind of problem entirely. Where Hutchinson was force, Osgood was flair. He was Chelsea's heartbeat in that era. Creative, confident, and absolutely in love with himself in the way only truly gifted footballers can afford to be. He represented everything Chelsea were in those years. Swagger, style, a kind of arrogance that was almost glamorous. Hunter had no time for any of it. But what makes the Osgood grudge different from the others on this list is that Hunter took it beyond the tackle. He admitted it himself. He'd tug Osgood's famous sideburns during set pieces, not to hurt him, to get inside his head, to chip away at that composure, to make the performance personal. It says something about how much Osgood irritated him. Hunter had to go that far. A man who could end most careers with a single, well-timed challenge felt he needed psychological warfare against a man with long sideburns. And it worked, sometimes. Osgood didn't like it. He'd react, argue, lose focus for a moment. But then he'd do something brilliant, and the crowd would roar, and Hunter would be back to square one. That was the cycle of it. Hunter would chip away, Osgood would respond with skill, and the hatred between them would build another layer. By the time the 1970 replay came around, they didn't need any introduction. They already knew exactly what they thought of each other. The Leeds-Chelsea wars of that era were unique in English football. These weren't just two clubs with different styles. They were two clubs who genuinely, openly despised each other. And that feeling ran from the boardroom to the boot room. When Hunter and Osgood shared a pitch, it was the purest expression of that hatred. Neither man ever softened on it. Two men remain, and the weight of these final two grudges is something else entirely. George Best was the most gifted footballer England ever had to deal with, and Norman Hunter's job, on those nights when Leeds met Manchester United, was to deal with him. Think about what that means for a second. You're a defender built on discipline, structure, the collective grind of a Don Revie system, and you're being asked to stop a man who operates outside every rule that football normally runs by. Best didn't just have pace or technique, he had instinct that no one could coach and no one could prepare for. He'd receive the ball in traffic and somehow find space that didn't exist a moment before. He'd go past you and make it look effortless, which was the part that got to defenders most. Hunter respected Best, that's the honest truth. In later interviews, he never hid that. Best was on a different level, and Hunter understood levels. But respect and resentment aren't mutually exclusive. Every time Best made him look slow, every yellow card Hunter collected, trying to contain what couldn't be contained, every moment the crowd reacted to something Best had just done, that accumulated. It cost Hunter something. His reputation took hits that weren't fully his fault. The enforcer always looks worse when the man he's enforcing against is a genius. Their encounters were bone-crunching. Hunter didn't do things by half, and Best didn't hide from contact the way some gifted players do. He'd take the challenge, keep the ball, and move on. That was almost worse than going down. Because going down gives the defender a moment, a pause, a reset. Best never gave you that. There was one match at Elland Road. Hunter came through Best with everything he had. A tackle that would have finished most players' night, maybe their week. Best got up, found the ball, and created a chance inside 30 seconds. The crowd didn't go quiet. They roared. And Hunter had to stand there and watch it happen and know that nothing he'd done had made any difference at all. That feeling, that specific, helpless feeling, is what the Best grudge was built on. Not hatred for the man, hatred for the situation. Hatred for the fact that for once, there was no answer. The frustration Hunter carried from those matches never fully left him. He couldn't say Best was dirty, he couldn't say Best was weak. He couldn't point to a moment where Best crossed a line the way Law had, or Hutchinson had. The grudge with Best was different. It was the grudge of a man who worked harder than almost anyone in football and kept running into someone for whom it all came naturally. That's a specific kind of wound that never quite closes. But if the Best grudge was a slow burn, the Francis Lee grudge was a detonation. Derby County against Leeds United. Two sides who needed no extra motivation to dislike each other, and two men, Hunter and Lee, who had been circling each other for years before they finally collided completely. What happened that day is well documented. Both men were sent off following one of the most famous on-pitch brawls English football has ever seen. It wasn't a mistimed tackle or a moment of heat, it was a fight, actual, sustained, witnessed by everyone in the stadium and eventually by the whole country. Francis Lee had a specific gift for provocation. He could draw a foul, sell a contact, and then look at you with an expression that suggested you'd done something unforgivable. Hunter despised that. The ability to play the victim while being the instigator was, to Hunter's mind, a form of dishonesty. And dishonesty on a football pitch was something he genuinely couldn't stomach. Lee provoked him. Hunter reacted. Both went off. But what people sometimes forget is how public it all was. This wasn't a dark corner of the pitch with only a few witnesses. It was broad daylight, a packed stadium, cameras running. Every punch, every shove, every moment of it, recorded, replayed, discussed, and then replayed again, every time someone wanted to make a point about the era or about Hunter specifically. Both went off, but the weight of it landed differently on each man. Lee moved on. He was built for controversy and largely unbothered by it. Hunter carried that afternoon with him for the rest of his life. Not because he was ashamed, he wasn't, or at least not fully, but because it became the thing people reached for first when his name came up. Before the caps, before the titles, before 15 years of serving Leeds with everything he had. The brawl with Francis Lee. That's what a grudge costs you when it plays out in public. It doesn't just burn in private, it becomes part of your story, whether you write it that way or not. Hunter never forgave Lee for making that happen. He never forgave the moment for becoming permanent. 7 names, 7 wounds that never fully healed. Hunter's grudges weren't weakness. They were the price of playing with everything you had, every single time. He left the world in April 2020, but these stories never left with him. If you want more deep dives into the men who defined English football's hardest era, watch the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming.